Okay, good morning. I think we can start. Some people are still joining us, but we will give them a couple of minutes to do that. Meanwhile, please let me introduce our today's seminar and welcome all the participants on the joint discussion of Russian International Affairs Council and of the European Council for Foreign Relations. And today we are discussing the book, The Age of Unpeace, How Connectivity Causes Conflict. Today we have the author of the book with us. It's Mark Leonard, the founder and the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And this book also brings us to wider discussions on the current developments and of the future world order, mainly in what direction the global order is developing, and what kind of the future we will have, and we will build it together, or will it be some group of the countries or individuals who will do that. We also have today with us Andrei Kortunov, RIAC Director General, and Igor Istomin, Associate Professor of MGIMO University, who will give their comments of the book and share their ideas on the questions the book raised. And today also with us is Svantia Green from European Council for Foreign Relations, head of campaigns, and she will co-moderate this discussion with me. And I'm glad to give the floor to Mark Leonard. He will share his main ideas of the book and some conclusions, and probably will be able to answer the question, what all these developments means for Russia as well. Please, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely thrilled to be doing this event. We've had a long and very, very successful cooperation with RIAC for many years now, and it's always great to do things together. And I'm particularly excited to, in fact, hear from many of the participants about what these things mean from Russia. I can lay out some of the trends in my book, The Age of Unpeace. Here it is for those of you who want to see it, which is essentially a book about a kind of profound change in our ideas about international relations, both the sort of world that we're living in at the moment, but also what the nature of power is. And I'll lay out some of the kind of basic ideas, but would love to hear more whether you see things in a similar light. And I think Russia is involved in many of these stories, both as a sort of active participant, but also sometimes as an object of some of these kind of trends. And I think many of the debates around these issues are probably more advanced in Russia than in many other parts of the world. So I'm particularly excited to have this discussion. My starting point is that just as we're getting used to COVID, we seem to be on the cusp of a new silent pandemic, which is spreading across the world. Like COVID-19, it's growing exponentially. It's exploiting cracks in our network systems, and it's constantly mutating to evade our defenses. But unlike the coronavirus, it's not a biological force that's affecting mankind, but rather a set of deliberate but toxic behaviors that are multiplying like a virus. And the reason that I'm so worried is because the connections between people and countries are becoming weapons. And if you just look at the news over the last couple of years, you can see countless examples of this happening. Most recently, the eyes of the world have been trained on the Polish-Belarusian border, where you've seen migrants being turned into weapons. It was very striking and kind of scary images which were coming out of this. But in fact, it wasn't a particularly original strategy that Lukashenko has developed. Academics who work on migration, like Kelly Greenhill, have shown that there are at least 75 attempts over the last few decades of what she calls coercive engineered migration, forcing people from their homes or encouraging them to leave their homes as a way of turning their movement into a currency of power to achieve political, military, or economic goals. And, you know, just in recent times, we've seen President Erdogan use the same technique against the European Union. The Moroccan government has done similar things. And you know, underlying it, I think, is a kind of different type of tension, which is the idea that, because, you know, a few thousand migrants, obviously not enough to flood Poland and Lithuania, but I think what is partly inspiring it is a sense that in today's connected world, one of the most important battlefields is about information rather than territory. And these interventions have produced sort of perfectly curated images that evoke the uncontrolled borders of the migration crisis of 2015, and that simulacrum of the crisis, I think, is a kind of act of information warfare, which is becoming increasingly common. One of the reasons why Lukashenko was interested in doing that was to push back against the sanctions which the European Union had introduced against Belarus. And it's certainly true that in international politics, sanctions are becoming a weapon of first resort, where people are increasingly both manipulating the global finance system and introducing entities lists and other kind of tools to turn economic links into a currency of power. We've seen the EU introducing sanctions against Russia, against Belarus, against all sorts of different countries. Russia's used sanctions against Turkey, China against Japan. The US in 2020 alone listed over 800 entities on its sanction lists. But the most kind of brutal sanctions are often to do with technology, where I think there's a new conflict over technology, which is changing the face of the global economy, as we see decoupling coming together with indigenous innovation and different competing entities lists being published in different countries. People are banning certain components from their supply chains, investing in building technological autonomy. And we're moving from a situation where there was kind of an aspiration of international science towards one where knowledge is much more confined to national boundaries, and where previously unproblematic sort of cultural academic relationships are being unwound as a result of geopolitics. And you know, various other things have been going on as well, which is sort of similar. Been lots of talk about global energy shortages and gas as a weapon. Gas and pipelines are in the news as the sort of tip of an iceberg of increasing competition around other kinds of infrastructure. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is seen by many as a way of actually creating a new world without the West, where China invents itself as a new kind of middle kingdom, binding countries into its sphere of influence through roads, railways, pipelines, ports, telecoms networks. And along with those different types of infrastructure is an increasing desire to set standards and rules about how these different things work, which is sort of reshaping the world. Anyway, if you put all of those things together and think about what, you know, Belarusian blackmail, European economic warfare, China, sorry, and the other big example, just before I do all of that, I think is what's happening on these big global issues like COVID and climate change, where you'd think, according to sort of international relation theories, that these would be things that would bring the world together and force us to focus on our common survival. Increasingly, they are being manipulated, weaponized, and are becoming tools of international competition, with mass diplomacy and vaccine nationalism on the one hand, and all sorts of attempts to extract advantage out of the carbon transition, where people suspect protectionism, blackmail, all sorts of things lying behind these loftier goals about saving the species from extinction. So if you put all of those things together and look at, sort of Belarusian blackmail, European sanctions, American technological warfare, Chinese bullying with masks, and I could have mentioned, thousands of other stories over the last few years, Iran kidnapping tankers in the Gulf, different attempts to hack elections or spy on people through their iPhones and other kinds of things like that. What you're seeing are a whole series of events happening which are quite dramatic, but they're not random accidents like asteroid falling from the sky or an earthquake. They're all new kinds of political violence. And they're all weapons which are perfectly evolved to exploit a weakness in our connected world. And that really is the sort of starting point of my book, which is that though, as like many Europeans, I sort of grew up as a sort of internationalist who was taught that binding nations and people together would create peace and make war more expensive. And that by opening borders and promoting trade, travel, and other kinds of human connections, you could almost create a sort of economic structure which would give us a common sense of destiny, which could then be overlaid with a political superstructure powered by the internet, which would create global harmony. What has actually happened over the last few decades increasingly is that this process of knitting the world together seems to have created at least as much conflict and competition as it has harmony and togetherness. And that these are not things that are happening because globalization is failing, but instead the problem is often that it's going too well. So I don't have enough time to go through the whole thesis, but I'm going to maybe highlight 5 sort of key points that I make. So the first point is that connectivity gives people a motive for conflict. And I look at that through lots of different prisms, but I'll just mention a few of the reasons why I've sort of came to that conclusion. The first is the sort of obvious one. I mean, working up from the level of the individual to the international system. So at the level of the individual, we're seeing how increasingly social media and the digital realm is leading to a polarization of our societies as people split into like-minded groups, living in their own filter bubbles with different facts, different media, different types of information. And this polarization or self-segregation of our societies has put the whole question of identity at the heart of our politics, where people are increasingly starting not with sort of more abstract ideas of interest or solidarity around class, but more a sense of who they are and trying to work out where they fit into the system. And this sort of leads to sort of second trend, which is that rather than leading to an expansion of our empathetic horizons, which we were told would happen with, initially with cable news and then with the internet, as you can find out about tragedies on far-flung parts of the world. The internet is leading to an epidemic of envy. And the key way it does that is it's changing our points of comparison. When I was growing up, we would mainly compare ourselves to our neighbors or maybe our parents or our grandparents. But now everyone in the world can compare themselves to the most privileged and successful people in the world, sometimes not even real accounts of their lives, but fictional accounts of their lives. And that creates an overriding sense that their own world can't possibly keep up with these perfect images of life elsewhere, which means to a sort of floating sense of dissatisfaction and grievance and competition, which is very much at the heart of our politics in different places. But it doesn't just happen at the level of individuals. If you look at the COVID crisis, you had daily charts showing the relative performance of different countries on different things. And that also sort of brings out this age of comparison or hyper comparison, I think brings out competitive rather than cooperative instincts. A third sort of feature of connectivity, which leads to conflict, is an overriding sense of a loss of control. The leitmotif of politics everywhere is about taking back control in a world that has become so interconnected that our sovereignty is being destroyed. In many ways, the experience of all countries, even the sort of former imperial core, is similar to how the periphery felt during colonial times, where decisions were being made which shaped their lives, but which were not made because of their sort of indigenous conditions, but for reasons which were quite kind of alien to them. And during colonial times, it was even the names of countries like Côte d'Ivoire or Argentina, reflected the commodities that other people were extracting from them rather than life in the particular places. And now, paradoxically, the countries that seem to feel the most out of control are the old imperial centers. It's the UK that voted for Brexit. It's the US that voted for Trump. And have that same sort of sense of humiliation and of lack of control that the periphery felt. Anyway, I'm not going to carry on for much longer, but that's the sort of first question about connectivity giving people a motive for conflict. And one of the key relationships I look at in the book is the US-China relationship. And I show how, in fact, the promise of globalization, that it would lead to convergence and that convergence would lead to harmony, is based on false premises. I show that, in fact, the more the US and China become like each other, the greater this conflict, the greater the potential for conflict. The second kind of argument is that connectivity creates an opportunity for conflict. So one of the big features of the last few decades has been the decline of armed conflict. I joke in the book that the age of Tolstoy is over. We no longer live in a world that's defined by periods of war and peace which punctuate each other. Instead, war has become great power conflict is so expensive and so dangerous because of nuclear weapons that it barely happens anymore. Less than 70,000 people get killed in armed conflicts every year at the moment. Many more people commit suicide every year than die in wars. But what connectivity does is lowers the costs of conflicting with each other and creates a whole series of options for great powers to fight with each other without triggering a nuclear war. And essentially, this is leading to what I call this sort of Age of Unpeace, which is a period where you don't have any sort of conventional great power wars between armies on different battlefields. But at the same time, there's been, as I said at the beginning, a kind of pandemic of violence and of competition going through the system, which is quite unregulated, which goes under the radar of international politics, and which is in fact affecting hundreds of millions of people around the world. So if armed conflict only kills 70,000 people, there are hundreds of millions of victims of these connectivity conflicts that we're talking about. And the reason for that is the sort of third argument which I make in my book, which is that as well as giving people a motive to conflict with each other and an opportunity to fight, connectivity's created a whole new arsenal of weapons. I talked about some of these weapons at the very beginning, these kind of seemingly disparate events in different fields in different parts of the world, but which all have one thing in common, which is that they are about turning interdependence into a currency of power or a weapon. And in the book, I use the metaphor of great power politics being like a loveless marriage where the couple can't stand each other's company, but are unable to get divorced. And as with an unhappy couple, it's the things that we shared during the good times that become the means that we use to harm each other and hurt each other in the bad times. In a marriage, it's about who gets the dog, the holiday home, or custody of the children. But in geopolitics, is every single facet of globalization which was meant to be bringing us together, which is now being turned into a weapon. Trade, migration, infrastructure, the internet, the solution of global problems like climate and COVID. My sort of fourth point is that this creates new rules of power. The journalist Thomas Friedman claimed that our globalized world would be flat, but in fact, we've now learned that the opposite is true. It's an uneven and mountainous network. Some countries are much more central to the system than others. They can cut rival nations off, use their control of hubs to assert their power. There's nothing new about instrumentalizing connections between countries. Sanctions go back to the Peloponnesian War. But what gives this a completely different complexion is firstly the density of the network of connections which bind the world together, and secondly, the asymmetry in it, which creates all sorts of opportunities for exercising power and gives things like sanctions, blockades, PR campaigns, a viral quality and a deadliness that didn't exist before our world was defined by these kinds of networks. And it does mean that the world that we're in is totally different from the Cold War, where you had very few links between the sort of main competing blocks. The kind of fifth and final point that I wanted to make is that this world has created a huge number of opportunities, particularly for middle powers to compete. Unlike nuclear weapons, which are very, very difficult to get hold of, all countries can use some of the techniques that I've been talking about, whether it's weaponizing migrants or information warfare or cyber war or sanctions. And we've seen a lot of middle powers or regional powers finding that they have many more geopolitical options than they had either during the Cold War or during the unipolar period of the post-Cold War. But at the same time, there are big differences between the options which are available to countries like Turkey or Iran or Saudi Arabia, who've been very active in different ways on this field, or even Russia, that in many ways has sort of pioneered and understood the potential of this network world before many other countries did. And the three kind of empires of connectivity that are able not just to be tactical players in this world, but are in fact able to change the way that the system works. And I sort of argue that there are three blocks which have such deep connections with the rest of the world that they are in a slightly different position where they can actually have more of a systemic rivalry rather than simply engaging in sort of bilateral conflict with one another. The US is the most obvious, and what I kind of argue is that in the 21st century, increasingly what we're going to see is this systemic rivalry take the form not of a battle between democracy and autocracy, but rather different understandings of power and of how networks and connectivity should be run. And I kind of argue that the future is probably less going to be a bipolar world or a non-polar world, but more a clash between these three empires of connectivity. So I spend a lot of time in the book trying to really understand how these different powers think about these things. I'm going to do it in 3 sentences now, just because I want to have a big discussion. But the US is obviously the kind of most powerful country, and I call it the gatekeeper power, because what it tends to do when it looks at the map of the network world is to focus on the hubs, those areas where lots of connections go through one point and where the US is controlling that hub. And the dollar and the US dominance of the internet allow it to shut other countries out the global financial system, or to put their citizens under surveillance. And we've seen through Snowden, through the sort of global war on terror and sanctions regimes, the power which the US has enjoyed as a result of its gatekeeping in those areas. China has got a very, very different way of thinking about connectivity. Chinese international relations experts talk about China as a relational power. And they argue that when they think about power, they think less about the kind of agents in the system or the hubs, but they think more about how many links there are between different countries and the centrality of the powers to those links and the nature of the relations between them. So they focus as much on the ties as they do on the nodes in our networks. And as I said earlier, the kind of core philosophy behind Chinese foreign policy is very much about thinking about how China can become a new middle kingdom, connecting countries to it and using its market and infrastructure links to build a different type of Chinese sphere of influence, which is based on the very hierarchical bilateral ties between Beijing and every other country in the world. And the EU, I think, I know there'll be some skepticism probably from this audience about how powerful the European Union is. And it's certainly true that for all the talk of a Brussels effect, the anti-Brussels effect on European ideas is equally strong in many parts of the world. But I think that what we've seen from Europe is an ability to focus not so much on the hubs and on the ties which you have as on the rule book, the operating system for our global networks. And the EU has often managed to use its market and its other economic assets to externalize its view of the world. That's coming to an end through the enlargement process. But if you think about the big battles of the 21st century around data and around the carbon transition and things like that, I think the European Union will continue to be a sort of powerful player at the level of rules. Anyway, that's the sort of core description of the world that we're in. I end the book with a chapter which tries to think about what we can do about it. And I sort of argue there that people are wrong to think about the big battle of our age as one between open versus closed worlds. But a better way of thinking about it is more to think about a choice between having managed and unmanaged globalization. I sort of argue that rather than having grand architects to design a new open world order, what we need instead are therapists to help us accept the reality of a world where all of the good features of connectivity are inextricably entwined with bad ones, and it's impossible to untangle them without destroying the big advances in our civilization. So therefore, rather than eradicating connectivity's dark side with a grand design, what we need is strategies for shaping and surviving this reality. If during the Cold War, the biggest danger to the world was the idea of a nuclear holocaust, and the solution to that was arms control, the equivalent for our age has to be about trying to find rules and norms which make connectivity a bit less dangerous. And I use this slogan of disarming connectivity as the goal that we should have. And there are lots of concrete ways that you can do that in different areas, from migration to trade to technology. I set out a 5-step therapy program for the world at the end of the book, but I'm not going to go into that now. I will just say that the first successful step of any therapy program is accepting that there's a problem, and that's the sort of core purpose of my book. It's an intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to jump in now and sort of hand the floor to Andrei Kurtinov. Do you accept this problem, or the way that Mark has sort of problematized the world? How does this land with you?
Oh, here I am.
Perfect.
Yeah, first of all, let me thank the European Council for relations for the opportunity to have this event together with RIAC. Indeed, we have a long-term institutional partnership, and it's great that we go beyond the situational issues like Syria or the migration crisis between Poland and Belarus to more general theoretical issues. And of course, I'm personally very pleased that we have Mark Leonard with us. I have to confess that I'm a long-term admirer of his work. I recall his first major book on Europe, which was published, I think, some 15 years ago already. Time really flies. And I think it was a very interesting and a very solid case for Europe. For those of you who have not read it, it is about how Europe will run the world in the 21st century. And though Europe is not running the world today, at least not the way we would like, probably Europe to be central to the international system, but the century is not over. And I think that there is still a chance, and maybe not a small chance, that Europe is likely to reemerge as a rule settler in the international system, at least in many areas of international relations. And I also recall the second book of Mark Leonard, which was on China, and it was a very compelling and a very persuasive work on what we could and should expect from the regime in years to come. I have to say that, of course, there are many authors who are trying to be contrarian, who are trying to challenge the conventional wisdom about international relations and would like to provoke discussion. But Mark Leonard is more than a contrarian. I think that he is always one or maybe even two steps ahead of the curve. So what he says and what he writes might look almost incredible, but time flies, and in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years, it turns out that he defines the political mainstream in the West. Therefore, I would strongly recommend those of you who have not acquainted yourself with the recent book of Mark Leonard to do so. And indeed, I think it's an important observation to look at connectivity, not just as something positive, not just from its good side, but also to remind ourselves that connectivity is good, is bad, and is sometimes ugly. And we should not forget about these dimensions of connectivity, which sometimes is not a part of the solution to our problems, but probably a part of these problems in itself. And I think this is important. I think that Mark makes his case quite convincingly, I would even say artistically, in his book. And this is definitely that we should reflect upon. Let me say that I agree with most of the findings, and I'm particularly pleased that Marx goes beyond this, conventional juxtaposition of democracies versus autocracies. I think though such a divide exists in the international system, but it is not the only divide, and probably not the most important divide. And here I definitely agree with Mark, and I disagree with President Biden, who is now trying to put together a summit of democracies. I think it's a questionable initiative. But let me get to some of the concluded normative issues that Mark raises in his book. He gives us a couple of pieces of advice on how we can fix connectivity. We cannot get rid of the ugly side of connectivity. We cannot get rid of the bad side of connectivity, but we can probably manage these negative implications on connectivity, and we can emphasize the good side of connectivity. My personal take is that we will be back to more connectivity than we are right now. I would even say, if I were to make comparison with the theoretical physics, I would say that right now the international system is in the stage of nuclear fission. We see a disintegration of the traditional hierarchies, we see a process of deconstruction, and we see a process of breaks in global connectivity. But this period will not last forever. I think that we will be moving away from nuclear fission to nuclear fusion. Hierarchies will be back, and connectivity will be back. So I think that it's very challenging to reflect on how this connectivity will be different from what we witnessed in the beginning of this century. And I understand that my time is running short. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I think that we should reflect on some of the ideas that Mark puts in his book. I would, first of all, I would think about the players of this new connectivity, because the previous connectivity was based on the hegemonic role of the United States mostly. And Mark points out that there will be at least 3 centuries of connectivity in this world. So we will witness a world with the non-hegemonic globalization and connectivity, and our old perceptions of the global center and the global periphery might have to be reconsidered. And that is an important change, of course. It complicates the picture of the world, it complicates the decision-making process. It puts more emphasis on multilateralism, which is still, to some extent, is an uncharted sea for all of us. So this is something that we should keep in mind, and this is something that we should probably focus our research more on in a more precise way. My second idea is that we should be also reconceptualizing our perception of connectivity drivers, because at least in my viewpoint, the major drivers of connectivity in the beginning of century were primarily large financial institutions. Financial institutions, to some extent, social media, but definitely the financial sector was ahead of the industrial sector. It was ahead of cultural connectivity, and we witnessed a clear disconnect between the two, which created major stumbling blocks on the way to connect further. And I think that this multi-speed connectivity is something that we will see in the future as well. Although my take is that probably the next stage of globalization will be defined more by social factors than by financial factors. I don't want to go into detail, it will take too much time, but this is my vision. And finally, this is something that I would probably slightly disagree with Mark in his perception of major actors. He speaks of competition between 3 centers of connectivity with different models of connectivity: the United States, China, and the European Union. I think this is right, but when we're talking about global connectivity, I think the major dividing line will be not between the 3 centers. If we look really into more remote future, something 10, 20, 30 years down the road, the real borderline in the global politics will be not between the East and the West, not within this big triangle of advanced countries, but rather between the North and the South. And I think here is the future challenge of connectivity, The challenge is that the global south will simply drop out of this emergent system, and it will have a major stabilizing impact on the global north, and China will ultimately become a part of the global north together with the United States and the European Union. And finally, let me say that I fully agree with Mark that it's about therapy rather than about surgery. We're tempted to look for surgical means of resolving the problems, but under the current circumstances, it is very difficult to imagine that one surgical operation might really make the trick. Therapy has different rules of engagement. It cannot promise flashing successes. Illnesses will be with us for a long period of time, but therapy, I think, is still something that we should consider. And here, I think scholars, academics, experts might play an important role. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei Vadimovich, for your perspective and for your analysis. And now I will give the floor to Igor Istomin, Associate Professor of GIMO, who will also share his impression and ideas after reading the book, and maybe some of his thoughts and vision on the question raised in the book. But before that, just a short remark. After Igor's intervention, we will open the floor to open discussion. And I invite all the participants to write their questions in the chat or raise their hands to ask the question. And now, Igor, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you to RIAC and to ECFR for this opportunity to participate in a discussion on such a fascinating book. I just wanted to say from the very beginning that it was a real treat to read it. I have to admit that I first opened it at some spare moment between certain other businesses, thinking that I will have to stop at some point and then return to the book maybe later, maybe the next day. But once I got into it, I just couldn't stop until I finished the whole volume. So I just recommend everyone who is joining to certainly buy this book, but also be prepared to set aside all other commitments when they start reading it, because it is so kind of great joy. And I want to emphasize from the very start that this is a piece of great writing, very enjoyable to read. Mark brings great clarity and structure in his prose, and thus it is remarkably easy to follow his thought and to follow his argument. And I think it is very helpful. And moreover, the book is packed with enormous amount of captivating empirical examples. And it contains so many pairs of anecdote and data that I learned absolutely incredible amount of new information from reading this book that I have to proceed still and have to, somehow now to understand how to live with all these different evidences from all parts of the world. But of course, the strongest and most important reason to read this book is because of its main argument, which basically goes against the common received wisdom that interdependence brings peace, prosperity, and universal happiness. Instead, Mark argues, and I believe convincingly demonstrates, that becoming, and here I quote, becoming more interlinked is not simply a source of understanding and togetherness. It is also the ever more bitter division and conflict. And I have to say that I was fully converted to this way of thinking even before reading this book. It goes very much in line of my understanding of where of the world we are going on. But I'm really happy that now with this book, I have some ammunition to kind of to prove this point and to point to this book where these ideas are very convincing that the goods and the bads of the globalization are intricately linked to each other. And I think when I was reading, the one thing I was thinking I was missing was a kind of epigraph to this book. I think there's none of this. And one which came to my mind, it's a biblical one, and it comes from Matthew 10:36, And it goes like, and the man voice shall be they of his own household. And I think it is something that rhymes well with what is told in the book. And on the other hand, this idea that the kind of the dependence and the connectivity is problematic. I think the people who study criminal statistics, they would completely agree with that, because there is a well-known thing that most issues of homicide happen between really close friends and relatives, unfortunately, not between the strangers. So because connections, as again Mark points out, provide both an opportunity and motive to incur harm, and not only to incur good. The book is filled with bold statements, however, aimed to provoke thinking in multiple directions. And obviously, it is hard for me, as I believe to some other readers, to accept all of them at face value. At one moment, for example, Mark speaks, among other things, regarding the consequences of the development of social media, big data, and artificial intelligence, when basically internet services know us better than we know ourselves, and which enables, obviously, as Mark writes, businesses to manipulate our choices, depriving us the freedom to choose for ourselves. And I have to say that every time I open up Netflix or YouTube or Yandex or Google, I'm really appalled by the low quality of the devices and the kind of the absolutely unreasonableness. And I don't understand why they put me this advertisement, which has nothing to do with all my interests. So I'm not sure about this kind of things. But of course, these are kind of all minor issues on which we could discuss and agree or disagree, and it's really fascinating to discuss them. So I would suggest to focus my kind of critical part of my comments on three main issues. First, I have to say that Mark obviously makes a creative, important, and counterintuitive argument, but this argument is not necessarily new. And I think already in the second reference of the book, he points to a number of previous writings, including the famous book about Cohen and Nye, which dates to the early 1970s, basically 50 years, half a century from now, when they were already talking about the emerging complex interdependence and claiming that the power belongs to the less dependent actor in this interdependent environment. And I would even point even further back in history. If you look at the Marxist writing of the 1950s, 1960s, people like, I don't know, Immanuel Wallerstein or Prebisch or Andre Gunnar Frank, and they were already writing about the consequence of unequal exchange in an interdependent international environment. And therefore, it brings us the question, to what extent we are witnessing difference in quality about what Marx writes, or it's just the difference in quantity of the dependence and of the connections. And if it is just the quantitative change, is it so new and radical departure from the past, from something that we saw previously? Or it is just an evolutionary change, and then maybe it is not as urgent as Mark tries us to convince. I believe that the main difference, which kind of motivates the argument provided by Mark, is that the West is now finding itself more and more on the receiving end of the interdependence. Previously was on the kind of, on one end, on kind of affecting others, and now it is more affected by interdependence. And I have to say that Mark is obviously very clear about the kind of political preconsiderations of his writing. He states that he is not a neutral observer, but his analysis is motivated by the real problems that bother him deeply. And this is the result of these developments where the West, due to its decline in predominance, face more trade-offs in connectivity than it did in the past. But perhaps in other parts of the world, the conclusions that he finds will be less surprising and less kind of counterintuitive. Another political aspect of the book, and here Marco already predated my comment in a way, because I find somewhat a similar wishful thinking that I find in many of the Russian writings on the present state and the future of the world order. In Russian debates, we can see a lot of discussion of the trilateral composition of the world order, emphasizing the three main players in the world, obviously US, China, and Russia as the centers of power in international arena. Mark similarly identifies three main players in the forthcoming world, although he views the EU rather than Russia as one of the principal nodes of the interconnectedness. And I have to say that I personally have deep skepticism that the EU, similar to Russia, could be on the same level as US and China in the foreseeable future. I think the difference, the important difference, which we have to take into account, is between players which have power in all spheres and could participate and affect all kinds of networks, rather than niche powers. And obviously, Mark puts Russia as one of the niche powers, but I think the EU also fits in the same category. And the two principal characteristics which serves as preconditions to become principal nodes in the network, for my mind, are still magnitude of the node and the unity of purpose. And perhaps, as Mark rightly demonstrates, Russia lacks in the magnitude, but the EU certainly lacks in the unity of purpose. So I think rather than talking about tripolar world, we need to ask question posed by Jan Seetun in the interview cited in the book. Will the EU be at least neutral in the US conflict with China, or will it be more or less faithful follower of the US? And it seems that from the developments of the last couple of years that we are moving into the second scenario. And I really feel badly about that for the simple reason that the more the EU will move to align to Washington, the more Russia will be dependent on China. And as a result, the more Europe will be divided by a front line, perhaps not between the two camps, but between the two networks. And we need to cite that unlike the previous Cold War in the 20th century, it will be not the central front of this division. And by the way, one more comment on that is that I think Mark views conflicts through connectivity is a replacement of the military conflict of the war. I would say that it is, as we see it now, it could be a supplement rather than something instead. And finally, the last point that I want to mention is that Marx talks about the need not to dislodge, but to disarm connectivity. But it seems very difficult to kind of see this, how it is possible, due to his previous claims that the beds of the connectivity are intricately connected to goods of the connectivity. He provides very specific recommendations, like recognize the problem, impose self-restraint, selective decoupling is an important recommendation. But the obvious question for these recommendations is who will be the judge where we need to decouple, and whether the US, the Chinese, the Europeans, and the Russians will decide that they need to decouple in different areas and to different degrees. And finally, the decoupling, as far as I see, is already moving forward. I certainly would not agree with those who claim that the globalization is over. We are in the age of deglobalization. But what we are witnessing is more emphasis on reshoring, on nearshoring, on protectionism. And more generally, there are signs that we can move in the direction where we will be less dependent on global connections in fulfilling our material needs. And I think the economic globalization is crucial for the information globalization and for financial globalization, for all other parts of the globalization. And it predated the financial and information globalization. So I would try to be very careful with raising these anticipations, but if the material foundations of globalizations are decaying, we can all return to all our corners as we did previously. And perhaps it will be somewhat less prosperous world. It will certainly undermine the problems that identify Mark as problems of connectivity, but it will return us back to the problems of misconnectivity, which we had previously. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor, for your perspective and for your ideas. And we already have a couple of questions in the chat, and probably we'll take these two. And after that, Mark would respond to Andrei, Igor, and these two people comments. Pavel Kanevsky, Moscow State University, please. Can't hear you, Pavel.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm able to turn the sound on. So thanks to RIAC and ECFR for this fabulous discussion. And Mark, thank you for your great book. It was a fascinating reading, a thought-provoking piece, I would say, and asking many right questions. And as a constant listener to The World in 30 Minutes, I listened some of your responses a month ago in a special issue of the podcast. But I think this topic really raises so many issues that need to be discussed further. And one of the ideas is of your key ideas that the line should be between managed and unmanaged connectivity. But how exactly would you divide these two kinds of connectivity? I mean, who would decide what is well managed and what is not managed? And what's even more important, who manages it? I mean, examples of weaponization of migration are the obvious ones, but then there are more ambiguous cases. I think Russia-EU relations is an interesting example here in general because it has both securitization of connectivity, but at the same time, there are many interconnected areas that are of mutual benefit for both Russia and the European Union. So I think we should really talk about different levels of connectivity, like, for example, business connectivity, civic connectivity, intergovernmental connectivity, and they all have different motivations. Actors inside these levels of connectivity, they all have different motivations and different driving forces behind that may or may not lead to securitization and weaponization of connectivity. I will reflect on what Andrei Kortunov said. I think we do need more connectivity in order for independence to become a win-win game. The key question is how to manage a return to win de-escalated connectivity. Who should be managing? My thought is that it's more about civil societies, businesses, networks who should take this role rather than governments and bureaucracy, who really, in my opinion, complicate connectivity. The latest big case of pandemic, I think, really shows that. Although that's where discussion on freedom, responsibility, and regime starts, we don't want to talk about it. But Mark, my question is a big one. What's your take on who should really be responsible for good, well-managed win-win connectivity? Thank you.
Thank you.
We also have a question here from Olga Trofimova, leading researcher of UNIMO. Her question is, are the conflicts driving today's refugee crisis symptomatic of the security, social, and interconfessional problems in Europe? And are they weakening the European collective capacity for conflict management? So that's the conflicts driving today's refugee crisis. Are they symptomatic of the security, social, and international problems in Europe? And are they weakening the European collective capacity for conflict management? Should we also take the question from Sergey? Woodke? Feel free to come in.
Hello, everyone. I have to admit I haven't yet read the book, but definitely this conversation incentivizes me to do so. I noticed that most of our discussion evolved around connectivity or some forms of disconnect between adversarial actors. I mean, we can formulate it differently, but these are big global centers that do not really trust each other. But if we look at, say, connectivity between allies, connectivity in the European Union, the European Union proclaims that one of its goals is to develop more connectivity between its members, be it infrastructural in all other capacities. But then you see that sometimes people start fearing these developed connections, and you can even sort of frame Brexit as the consequence of such a fear of too much connectivity to the continent on the island, and this can also happen to the Schengen zone. This can happen in to many dimensions of the EU activities. So just as a thought, probably if we are looking for a constructive way of managing connectivity, we could start with sort of a simpler case when you don't have these adversarial relationships, but you have people who work together all the time, who meet each other, and still they find it difficult to even sell the idea of broader connectivity to their peoples, to the voters, and they face indeed difficulties related to the fact that they cannot decide certain issues on national level when they are too much interconnected with the others. So my question is basically, have you included any of that in your book, or was it anything that you were thinking about, like how this connectivity develops between the allies?
Thank you, Mark. Could you please take this portion of questions as well as comments from Andrei and Igor, and then we will have another set of questions.
Thank you so much. It's been really, really fascinating and rich. I'm not sure I can do justice to these really perceptive and deep kind of questions that people have been asking, but I very much enjoyed everything that Andrei and Igor said, and I think we definitely agreed on a lot of the analysis. I would be curious actually to hear a bit more from you, Andrei, about when you say that the kind of future of globalization is going to be driven more by social forces than financial ones. I'd love, that was very intriguing and seemed like a very interesting thought, but I'd love to hear a bit more detail on that. With Igor, I think you're right as well that first of all, you know, the quantity of connectivity and the way that it's being manipulated is also a qualitative shift, because if every single aspect of our lives gets affected by that, that is actually, the quantity in a way is a quality. Because if I didn't use this because my publisher hated it at the moment, but one of the ideas, one of the thoughts that I had was that is the extent to which human nature has been changed by connectivity itself, and that we've become kind of homo superconnectors. This hyper-connected nature of our lives does mean that, you know, it changes everything from our kind of love lives to the way that the choices that we make, the way that we think about our identity in quite profound ways. So I'm not sure that you can really say that if the quantity is so huge that it doesn't create a qualitative difference, but it's definitely true that the poignancy of what's happening in places like the UK and the US comes from the fact that stuff that they were doing to other people around the world is now being done to them, and that is a kind of has been a game changer in politics in these sorts of places. And many ways, that was one of the sort of core arguments of my sort of thinking about connectivity, because you had these two waves of connectivity. The first 19th century wave driven by industry and empire, which connects the world and creates these things. But that's largely about the West doing stuff to the rest of the world. And then connectivity 2.0 after the end of the Cold War, which I think is different in nature for the reasons that I just been talking about, but also it's different because now the former imperial core feels that it is subject to a lot of these kind of sense of a loss of control, that things are being done to them, they're feeling humiliated, that their identities are not being respected. I mean, all the different kind of things which you find, and one of the riffs I have in the book is looking back at Fanon and a lot of the post-colonial literature. It's very similar to the arguments that people like Trump and Le Pen and other people are making. And they're talking about literally about independence. That's what Boris Johnson said, that the 23rd of June would be Independence Day for us. So there are kind of interesting parallels. With Pavel's question about how to manage a return to sort of win-win question, and who should be responsible for deciding what needs to be managed and how you manage it. I mean, and that sort of relates a bit to I mean, I think that it's very difficult, and I think relates a bit to some of the things that Andrzej and Igor were saying earlier, that I think in some ways what we need to accept is that it's very hard to step outside of this connected system, and you can't really have an independent arbiter who decides what gets done in what way. And that is why you need some quite a lot of decoupling, and of, I think, increasingly rather than seeing one world with global institutions that do everything, I think we're going to have a very thin international order. We should focus in on the few areas where connectivity is so dangerous that it could end up killing us or completely destroying humanity, and try and find some norms in those areas. But I think it's going to be a relatively small number of areas. And in other places, what you need to do is disconnect things enough in the most sensitive areas so that you don't have a perpetual escalating systemic rivalry through every point of contact we have with each other. And I think that's often going to be about kind of self-care. I mean, personally, we've done a lot of work at ECFR on the energy relationship between Russia and the European Union. There are some people who think that Europeans just shouldn't buy any Russian gas, and that any pipelines that connect Europe and Russia are kind of bad and make us vulnerable. That's not my philosophy at all. I think that there's nothing intrinsically right or wrong with consuming Russian gas. I think Russian gas is something that we need, and I'm very much in favor of having pipelines allowing us to buy Russian gas. But it's important that the relationships are structured in a way that allow us to be sovereign. And for me, sovereignty is about having choices. So if you have other options, so that you can have a kind of market-based relationship with supply and demand regulating it, and you look at what your other preferences are in terms of your energy mix and your climate goals and your other things, and you have the ability to do that, then it's a very positive thing being able to buy hydrocarbons from Russia or other sources of energy from Russia. But a lot of it depends on how you structure your own relationships. So the solution to the Russian energy weapon from a European perspective was about sorting out European energy markets, making sure you don't have energy islands that can't buy energy from anywhere else, making sure that you have the right regulations and the right competition policies and all of those sorts of things. But it's mainly about self-care and stuff that you can do for yourselves rather than asking another country to change what they're doing. And I think that increasingly that's going to be where a lot of the energy is going to be a national or a regional level, and we'll have a much thinner global sphere. But it's not an unimportant one, because it's important to have dialogue to make sure that you establish certain red lines and norms in areas which are really, really dangerous, and where we have a sort of common interest in it. But I think increasingly, the competition, particularly as we go through a power transition, it's inevitable there'll be a lot of competition between powers as people test out what options are available to them and take advantage of these sort of shifts. and therefore there will obviously be a temptation to instrumentalize globalization in the ways that we were talking about. For Olga's question about the refugee crisis and to what extent the sort of social, interconfessional, economic differences between countries are getting in the way of conflict resolution. Yeah, I mean, that's it's very dramatic. And is making it much more difficult. And that relates a bit to Sergei's point about things within the EU. I mean, I spend a lot of time on that in the book. I mean, for me, in a way, the EU both represents the ultimate proof that my thesis is right, because it's not that surprising that the antagonistic countries use everything they can to compete with each other. What is interesting is how connectivity has created much more tension within the EU, which is exactly where it was meant to get rid of tension. And Euroscepticism has been powered not by failures of the European model, but by its successes. That was one of the things that the Brexit debate brought into the forefront, that traditionally, when I first started working on the EU in the 90s on European legitimacy, people would look at the things which really didn't work about the European Union as driving Euroscepticism: corruption, the waste of the common agricultural policy. It's just stuff that was obviously not working as it was intended to work. And that was seen as the source of Euroscepticism. But during the Brexit referendum, the reason people were hostile to it was all the stuff that was working really well. It was freedom of movement, which was one of the kind of dreams that we have. It was the single market, which was driving wages down in some areas, which was very good for consumers, not so good for builders who were working in those particular parts of the economy where wages were going down. It was the euro in the backdrop, and all the things that were the kind of proudest achievement. And I think for me, what came out of that was a really profound lesson that we were looking at things in a really unhelpful way. And I think this is true at a global level, but certainly was true within the EU level. If you look at things at an aggregate country level or even a continental level, all of these forces, all of these achievements, whether it's free movement or the euro or things, have been good. They've created more wealth than they've destroyed it. They've made us richer, more secure, etc. But at the same time, large numbers of people in every single society feel that they've lost out as a result of it. And we weren't finding ways of mitigating their experience. You could easily have had a different approach to migration within the UK than the one that we did. We had a complete laissez-faire approach. The government said 13,000 people would come after the enlargement of the European Union. 1.5 million people came. The government didn't know where anyone went. They didn't register them. They had no idea who was coming in and out of the borders. So therefore, they couldn't move money to create school places and hospital places in places where large numbers of people went. They didn't really look at the impact on wages in different sectors and whether they could do anything to support the minimum wage. They didn't think about any ways of mitigating these things. And they just focused on the fact that companies wanted these workers, and people paid more taxes than they got in benefits. So it was obviously good for the UK. And it was at an aggregate level. But at the same time, 52% of people thought they weren't benefiting from this, as we saw in the referendum. It could easily have been fixed if you'd had a more nuanced idea about connectivity as a bad thing as well as a good thing, and then introduced policies to manage it. I think the same's true at a global level. In fact, it's very it's sort of, and that psychological element is very important. I've seen it. I mean, you can tell me more about that, but I think in EU-Russia relations, one of the things which pisses Russians, which upsets Russians the most, is being told that the end of the Cold War was a kind of win-win situation, that we were all victors, that there were no losers. If you deny the losers the sense that they're actually losing, that's even worse if you tell them that they're winners, whilst sort of bossing them around and depriving them of agency. That creates even more trouble. And I think that's one of the big problems with the way we've been thinking about globalization and interdependence. We've behaved as if it was a win-win thing, when actually it was maybe a win-win thing at the aggregate level. But there were lots of losers who we didn't think about and we didn't empower, and now they're fighting back. And politics in many parts of the world has been about a sort of counter-revolution to those forces. Sorry, those were quite long answers. I will leave it there. So in case we got time for any more, or unless maybe Andrei can also tell us a bit more about what he meant on globalization, because I thought that was really fascinating.
I don't know. I can see Andrei Vadimovich online right now. I've learned from my colleague that there are some problems with internet connection in his office.
Okay.
But maybe if he appears again, we can definitely ask him to do that. Meanwhile, we are running of time, but I think that it would be interesting to take one or two more questions and then to go to the conclusions. Is anybody from our audience would like to ask a question or give a comment? So no one, but there is a question in the chart, so I'll read it out. How is it possible for the greater powers, US, China, Russia, and the EU, to reach a compromise and to work together on the rules and norms to disarm the connectivity?
Well, I'd love to hear what other people think. I mean, I think I slightly answered that question earlier, and I think you can probably agree a very small number of norms in a few areas which are very, very scary. But actually, what we've learned now is that given the desire to take back control and to find agency, that actually in many areas, it's more going to be about disentangling us so that we don't get in each other's way and saving our own policy space. If you try and reach an agreement which is too ambitious, you'll just get bogged down in the sort of morass of that we're seeing many of our universal institutions like the UN found in at the moment, where they become sites for connectivity warfare rather than routes out of it.
Okay, thank you. And I had a talk previously with with Alexander Mikhailovich Kramarenko, who served in the UK embassy and who is a RIAC member, and he shared some interesting thoughts with me about the book. I don't know if Alexander Mikhailovich would like to comment or to ask a question now.
Меня слышно, да, Natasha?
Да, слышно.
Okay, I understand that we are short of time, but Mark, your book cannot be more timely, and I truly believe that. I quite agree with you that connectivity, the terms of which are not universally agreed and are rigidly enforced or even imposed, creates more problems than resolves. By the way, Leo Trotsky was quite prophetic with his "No peace, no war" in Brest 100 of years ago. And the main theme of Dostoevsky was that there can be no last word in humanity. And Jean Baudrillard, about 35 years ago, he foresaw the restoration of a human space of war, although he couldn't imagine that it will go beyond just conventional warfare. But we really see a clash of supranational and the national, even within the EU. Maybe those terms of connectivity, not consensual so far, have got to be reinvented, loosened, downgraded, scaled down, whatever. And maybe another question. Europe, of course, has got to be at the center of our debate, is a case in point. National identities of Eastern Europeans, including Russia, were frozen at the time of the Cold War. Now we see the thaw and its aftermath. As regards collective security, the NATO and the OSCE deny each other. Fyodor Tuchev, our diplomat, poet, and thinker, said in mid-19th century that Russia, by her very existence, denies the West's future. Does NATO's existence do the same towards a truly collective security in Europe? Do you think that the parable of the grain of wheat applies here, that NATO of club membership has got to die to give a life to a regional system of universal membership. Thank you.
Mark, please.
Thank you very much for, oops, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Very thoughtful comments, wonderful quotes from Trotsky and Baudrillard, which I think are really helpful and interesting. It's definitely the way that you were talking, in a way, sort of shows some of the challenges of the connectivity wars that we're in at the moment, where you have both these very high levels of interdependence, and then also, because you have all these different points of contact, those points of contact are seen as sites of systemic rivalry. And that, you know, that your quote about how Russia by its very existence deprives Europe of its future shows exactly the danger of where the sort of connectivity wars can go, where, you know, if we are totally connected, every single point of contact can become a kind of a battleground. And you're seeing that emerging in the US-China relationship in ways that is where geopolitics has entered things which just didn't feel at all geopolitical. In my book, I have this story about this Chinese, of a Texan cancer researcher of Chinese origin. And she's worked for decades. She's been an American citizen for 20 years. And she ended up being driven out of her job because she had been cooperating with Chinese universities, but she was not doing this in order to hack American systems or to share data or anything. She was trying to find a cure for cancer, which is what her institution was designed to do, to find a cure for cancer for Texas, for the United States and the world. So it was literally in line with the mission state of her institution. But the rules changed between when she first started working there, when the kinds of things she was doing was seen as wonderful and beneficent, to where we are now, which is where healthcare is another battleground in this kind of idea of systemic rivalry. Personally, I don't think that that the existence of NATO is you know, one of the kind of core drivers of geopolitical instability. I think that some of the debates around it are more symptomatic of the underlying tensions which are going on. I mean, I think it's a bigger discussion about it. I think, you know, there were definitely some opportunities missed at the end of the Cold War in terms of how we thought about the regional architecture of the European space. I wrote a report about 5 or 6 years ago with Ivan Krastev called The Danger of the Spectre of a Multipolar Europe. And I kind of said that what we need to do is to reconceptualize European security as around the sort of coexistence of a number of different regional projects. You have the European Union, you have a lot of well, at that time, the Eurasian Economic Union, which was kind of rising up, and Turkey playing an increasingly active role. And I think we do need to find ways of coexisting and of making these different institutions working together. But ultimately, you know, if I'm right about this desire for control and sovereignty being at the heart of the system, I think one of the areas which is most difficult is how you can think about this in a way that preserves the sovereignty of countries which are, you know, trying to find their own way, whether it's about Ukraine or Georgia or other places. And that is going to be an enormous source of tension. But these countries are not in NATO, so I don't really think that NATO is a sort of core. I don't think that NATO has to die in order to think about European security in a different way. But I think there is a very interesting case study for the wider problems that we talked about, what we do in the European space, and what happens when the world changes fundamentally. And I think, you know, it is striking how little institutional innovation there was immediately after the end of the Cold War, where the main thing we did was just to expand the Western institutions, rather than thinking about reframing it. We can't go back in a time machine now. I think that actually there have been enormous benefits as a result of some of the enlargement of the EU, and actually even NATO as a sort of precursor. But I think NATO's also changed in nature since the end of the Cold War. It's become a different kind of organization, and it's perpetually reinventing itself as well. And I don't think it's really clear at this exact moment what its core purpose is. Some people think that it needs to shift more towards being part of this new geopolitical constellation where the Indo-Pacific is the core battleground rather than the Atlantic and Asia. Other people think that that we should reorganize the kind of NATO from the inside and actually have a clearer idea of a European pillar within NATO, with Europeans taking more responsibility for it. But there are lots of ambiguous questions within it. And Turkey and the debates around Turkey and between Greece and Turkey and Cyprus and Turkey add quite a lot of tension to some of these internal workings. And the US itself is obviously, no longer thinking of itself as a European power in the way that it did earlier. So there is quite a lot of relationship management that needs to happen between Europeans and Americans about exactly what role the US is going to play. So, in a way, I don't think that NATO is the core of any of these problems. I think these bigger power shifts and identity shifts that are going on are quite profound, and they will mean quite big changes to the nature of the institutions, their missions, their makeup, and how they work with each other over the decades ahead. And I think that NATO is going to change just as the EU changes. And ultimately, I think that if we are going to have security in Europe, it's going to have to be something where there are much more positive relationships between the main stakeholders. And I think the biggest stakeholders obviously are both the European Union and the US, even if it's in a different kind of role to where it's been beforehand. But the biggest challenges are how to engage with Turkey and Russia in a different way, and to find cooperative institutions which work better than the ones that we have at the moment, which are sort of bogged down and are symptomatic of a lack of trust and some of these philosophical differences. The fact that they seem to be so dysfunctional, whether it's the Council of Europe or the OSCE, they're not institutions which are full of energy and which are helping us solve a lot of the security problems that we face.
Thanks so much, Mark. We are vastly over time, but it's been a fascinating conversation. Let me just turn to Mark and Igor. One sentence for concluding remarks, and then we should close to let you get on with your Friday.
I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for being so generous with your thoughts and your ideas. I think some of the most sophisticated and interesting ideas about international relations and globalization are being developed in Russia. You've been thinking a lot about the issues that I'm writing about. And I think that as some of you said, some of these ideas are maybe more counterintuitive outside of Russia than they are to an audience like this. But it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and I hope we can carry on the debate. And I certainly look forward to working more with RIAC in all sorts of different forms and in the future. But particular thank you to Igor and to Andre for their really thoughtful comments on the book.
I just want to say thank you to ECFR and RIAC for this event, and thank you, Mark, for the book. And for those who, like Sergey, haven't read the book, once again, recommendation to read it. It's just a fascinating read. Thank you.
And let me thank everyone on behalf of RIAC for joining us today, Mark for his presentation, Igor and Andrei for his comments, and all our participants for their comments and questions. And I hope that one day this book will be available in Russia and in Russian, so that wider Russian audience could read it. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you very much. Bye.